My name is Mark Pulowski. I'll be delivering this webinar today on creating React applications using TypeScript. So we're going to go over these topics. We'll talk briefly about React development. Then we're going to talk about TypeScript and what it is and what some of the features of TypeScript are. Then we're going to take a look at creating a new React application using TypeScript. And then once you've created an application or a development setup that uses TypeScript and creates React applications, then there's certain types of coding that you need to do for different features of React. So for example, if you're working with hooks, there are ways that TypeScript works into that. If you're working with a class-based component, there are ways that TypeScript works into that. So to start off with, we'll just mention what React is. I assume most people who've chosen to come to the webinar would have some idea of it, but just to level set and make sure we're all talking about the same thing. React's an open source JavaScript API. It's a library or API of code that allows you to create components, and those components can be composed or put together to create web applications. Okay. Now there's a whole ecosystem around React components that allow you to work with things like routing and state management and things like that. Those are all in separate libraries, even though they might be related to React. The React library itself is the central one that's used to create components. Started out back in 2013. Okay, it's maintained by Facebook. Okay. And up until now, there was a couple of different ways that you could create a React application that did not use TypeScript. You could use regular ECMAScript 5, which is the version or flavor of JavaScript that most browsers support completely right now. Okay, so if you write something in that version of JavaScript, you'll be able to run it on any browser without any modification. Now, in addition to that, you can also write React applications in ECMAScript 6. And ECMAScript 6 includes some features of JavaScript that are not part of the set that most browsers support. So for those features to work in a browser, the code that you write needs to be translated or transpiled into ECMAScript 5. Okay. Now, as long as it's doing that stage of translating from one version of JavaScript to another, it also has the chance to add the features of JSX. JSX is a way to compose HTML code or HTML template code inside of JavaScript, and it gets compiled down to standard JavaScript with a compiler, along with your ECMAScript 6 features. Okay. So that's kind of the history of the different versions of JavaScript that you can use. And each one has, different features that are easy to use and ones that are a little bit more difficult. Now, today what we're going to do is talk about TypeScript. TypeScript, as we'll see on the next slide, is a superset of JavaScript. So it includes everything that the other versions of JavaScript includes. Okay. And it needs to be transpiled, just like ECMAScript 6 does. And it can be transpiled along with JSX code. So you can still use JSX when you're working with TypeScript for your React applications. So why would they want to use TypeScript? What's the difference, the main takeaway thing that you're going to get from using TypeScript? Well, that's this thing called type safety. Okay. Type safety allows developers to find and fix a lot of issues before the app goes into production. Okay. So these issues are going to be found during that transpilation stage. Okay, and that's during development. So whenever you save a file, that file is going to be converted over to regular JavaScript, and at the same time, it's going to find any issues that are related to type safety. Okay, and we'll describe type safety in a minute. Some of the other features, though, that TypeScript enable is enhanced object orientation. Now, you do have classes in ECMAScript 6, okay, but TypeScript even enhances it more than that. So there's more features, things you can do with your classes under TypeScript. That makes it a little bit easier to work with. Okay. TypeScript is, at this point, well supported by different integrated development environments. Okay. The one that we find works really well right out of the box and is free is Visual Studio Code. Okay, it's already set up. You don't even have to add a plugin, and it'll handle TypeScript. So let's talk a bit about type safety. Okay, the idea behind type safety is to fix issues where data that gets passed into methods or returned from methods is of the wrong type, right? And which is easy to do with JavaScript because JavaScript has var as your way of creating variables, and you can't create a variable of a specific type. You create a var, and that var can hold numbers, or it can hold strings, or it can hold booleans, and that data that it holds can change over the run of the application. So you can start off and say var x equals 25, and then later on you can say var x equals and pass it a string, or you can set var x equal to false. Okay, you can imagine that if you pass this x into a method that requires a string, you don't really know for sure whether that x holds a string or not. Okay? And that's part of what TypeScript is about. It's to make sure that when you set up variables, you say, or you commit to the type that you want that variable to be, and then during the run of the application, it is that type. It doesn't change types. Okay, so you can be guaranteed that if you pass it into a place that needs that type, so if you pass a string in where a string is needed, you're not going to have a problem with the data being incorrect in that way. Now, of course, the data that is held can always be incorrect. Okay, that's another issue. Okay, but there's a lot of types of problems that come about because well, in JavaScript specifically, because data is being passed that shouldn't be passed. Okay? So that's what type safety is about. Okay? And there's even places in React where the idea of type safety has been important already, even before TypeScript was introduced to it. For example, when you have properties and you want to set the prop types, or the property types, that's a way of making sure at compile time that the right kind of data is being passed as a property, right? So that's a small bit of type safety that's available even if you don't use TypeScript. Okay. So some of the features that I mentioned here, type safety. Another feature that we'll talk about when we see some examples of code is generics. Okay. So if you have a type for something, you may want to create a method or a class that does some kind of work, and you don't want to be very specific about the type of what that does. So just say you have a method that's called make array, and you want this to be like a factory for creating arrays. Now you could create different kinds of arrays, string arrays or number arrays or Boolean arrays. But if you're using type safety, you might wind up making 3 different methods. One that's called make Boolean array, one that's called make string array, and one that's called make number array. Okay, so in that case, you're actually repeating a lot of code. So that's where generics come in. You're able to create one method called make array and then just use this thing called a generic, okay, to specify later on in the process what type you want to be applied to it. Okay. TypeScript is a superset of ECMAScript. Okay, so as you see in this little diagram on the right, TypeScript includes all the features of ES7, ES6, and ES5. Those are ECMAScript versions. So it includes everything that they have, and then it includes the type safety that it offers. Okay. Some of the things that it borrows or it supports from ECMAScript 6 that are popular include classes for doing object-oriented programming, arrow functions, and template strings. So these are the kinds of things that are part of the ECMAScript 6 feature set that also appear in TypeScript that are very useful in a lot of applications. Okay. So of course, we don't want to really talk about it so much. We want to actually go in and do some coding and take a look at what that looks like. Okay. So let's talk about creating a React app with TypeScript, right? This is the way you would create a regular React app. If I went here and said npx create React app, and then I gave it a name, okay, that would be enough to create a project directory, in this case called TS React app, for doing React development. Okay, all I need to do to create a TypeScript version of that project is to run this with this here, --template TypeScript. Okay, so let's give this a try. I'm going to bring up the Visual Studio Code. Okay, give me 1 second, I'll bring it up. Got some other things on my other screen. So, okay, here we go. So I've actually just created this one here, my React app. Okay, but I'll show you what it looks like when you go to create it. Okay, it's going to be, if we want to create a new one, npx create React app. That part you probably already know. And then I'll call this app 02 and TypeScript React. Okay. And then --template TypeScript. Okay. So npx is just a version of npm, the node package manager, that will go out to the repository on the internet and bring down create React app and run it at the same time. Okay. So you don't have to install create React app first. You just run it right with npx. Give it the name of your app. Okay. It's going to create a directory of that name. And this time, the type of that development environment is going to be a TypeScript environment. Okay. So this will take a little while, right? We know that it's going to be downloading some files, and then it's going to be downloading or creating the dependencies. Okay. So let's do this. Let's go to this directory here, which I did earlier, my React app. Open up a terminal there. And this is a fresh project. I haven't done anything with it yet. So let's just run it. npm start will be enough to run the start script in the package.json file, which tells it to start up the React scripts, okay, which will start the application. Now, what you're going to see is not really much different than what you would imagine it would create if it wasn't using TypeScript. Okay, let's see. Okay, this one. Okay, we don't want that one. We will in a minute, but this one here, let me just make sure I've got the right one. My TS app. Okay, we'll go back. So what we want to do is we want to have one that's fresh, that hasn't been worked on yet. So that one has my React app, and then TS React app. Let's try this one here. One of the nice things about the way that React is set up is that it will choose another port. If you already are using a certain port, it'll ask you, like it did right there, if you want to use a different port, and then it'll bring up the application on that port. So it saves you some reconfiguration. So this is what your application looks like when it starts, okay? And you notice it says edit source app TSX and save to reload. Okay, so what's saying there is this is the name of the app file, okay? And the app file has an extension TSX. So what that stands for is TypeScript and JSX. Okay, so it's gonna, when it sees that file, when the environment sees that file, it will compile it down. It'll read the JSX, it'll compile that. It'll read the TypeScript and compile that, okay? So let's go take a look at that application here. So that was a TS React app. Again, this is a fresh one that we haven't done anything with. And if I go to this, you'll notice it has the same example code as it did for when it was not a TypeScript version of the app. So there's nothing TypeScript specific about this, even though it's in the TSX file. What that means is that there's just nothing that the compiler needs to do. It just reads it and says, oh, this is all okay, and I can use it as is, okay? But let's just remove some of this stuff that we don't need and just create ourselves maybe an H1 tag. And it's going to be called TS React app. What we're going to do is we're going to also add a couple of components to it, and those components will be set up so that they're written with TypeScript. Okay. So let's go back to the application. Now here we've modified it so that it just shows TS React app. Okay. Before we go any further, let's see if there's anything left from that presentation that we wanted to look at, and then we'll go back to the code. Okay, so we created the application, we went into the directory, we started it up, comes up like it normally does on a local host port, okay? And then it says edit this particular file in order to customize the app, which we've started doing and which we'll continue to do, okay? Now, one of the other things I wanted to mention before we moved on is how to add TypeScript to an existing app. Now, you may have created an application with Create React App before, and you're already working on it, and now at this point you want to start working in TypeScript with that application. Let's say it's a proof of concept that you worked on, and you think it would be a good example app for you to try out working with TypeScript. You could either start it from scratch the way we just did, okay, or we can do what we see here. Okay, we go into the directory for the application that you've already created and that you may already have some code in, and then run this command, npm install, okay, which we know is the Node Package Manager install command. And we're going to add these things to that project, TypeScript, and then we're going to add different, what are called typings. Types for Node, types for React, types for the React DOM, and types for Jest. Okay. What typings are interfaces that allow you to access libraries that were not created in TypeScript using TypeScript types. Okay, so it adds types to existing code. Okay, so these are very lightweight pieces of code here, and in this case, they're letting us treat Node, React, React DOM, and Jest in a TypeScript manner, which is we're able to add type information to our variables and pass it around. Okay, so once you've done that, okay, you've added those things, then you need to change the extensions from star.js for JavaScript, okay, to star.tsx, and you can do that on the existing files. If it's an existing compiling, JavaScript file, then it's a valid TSX file, okay, which once you change the extension, then you can start adding TypeScript and other JSX features to it. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that, and then let's see where we go from here. Okay, so one of the things we're going to take a look at is using types with hooks. Okay, and we'll come back to this slide when we need it. And the other thing is setting up types for props and state. This is when you're creating a class-based component. Okay, you'll need to use that. So we'll come back to these as needed. For now, what we want to do is take a look at an existing JavaScript application and then convert it over to a TypeScript based. Okay. So here's the application that we're going to take a look at. Okay, it just has a couple of messaging components. Here's one that's a functional component, and it just says my message, so you're passing in a message. And the other one is a class component, and we've added some functionality to that, so we can change the theme of the component from a light theme to a dark theme if I click on it, like I'm doing now. Okay, so that's the JavaScript app, and let's take a look at what it looks like in code. Okay. So we'll go to my React app. We'll start off with the app.js file. You notice the extensions are JS. Okay? And all we have on here is that we're importing message test, which is going to be a file that has our message components in it. And then, message has our components in it. Message test is one of those components. And we're going to show that message test component on this screen. So that's all we need to see about the app.js file. And in fact, when we convert this for JSX, there's really no difference here. There's nothing in this file that's specific to either JavaScript or JSX. Okay? But let's take a look at this message.js. Okay? Okay. So we start off, we see that we're exporting this functional component called message test. Okay? And message test is simply a div that includes message 1 and message 2, which are two different types of components. Okay? Message 1 here, okay, just is a functional component that we saw on the screen. It says functional component, and then it takes the props that are passed in and gets the message property and displays the data for that. And we can see what that data is up here because we're passing the message in as my message. Okay, and if I change that to hi there, and I save it, we should see that the component will eventually, there we go, there it is. So hi there, and it's changed it, and the other one's still working the way it normally does. Okay. So let's take this first one here. We see it's a very simple functional component, and we want to add it to our TypeScript code. Okay. Our TypeScript code is currently this one here. So let's get rid of that one. So here's our JavaScript one, our TypeScript. So let's create a message.jsx file in that application. So my React app, let's go to TS React app and go down here under source, new file. It's going to be message.jsx. Okay. And we're going to start by copying some of the stuff that we see in message. Okay. And then we may need to fix some of it because it may need to be more specifically set up for what we're doing with TypeScript. Okay. Now, of course, we also want to show message text. Okay. So let's go back here. I'm going to take some other stuff out of the app.js file and put it into the app.tsx. Okay. So we're going to put message text there. And then what else did we have in there? We had this, we're just going to kind of cut and paste this stuff here. And you'll see that a lot of it can be cut and pasted without any changes. Here we're going to, yeah, we'll leave that top part in there. Get rid of this. Okay. Now, this is where we start to see some things that are specific to TypeScript. Okay. You'll get messages like this here. It's compiled with warnings. Okay. And it says exactly where those warnings apply. So in the app.tsx file on line 2, okay, it says that logo is defined, but it's never used. Now, in this case, I think I've already deleted that. So let's just try to make a change and save it again. See if it'll recompile. And I'm going to adjust these here so that all of the JavaScript ones are on the left and all the TypeScript ones are on the right. Okay. So here, there's a rule in TypeScript that you shouldn't have any unused variables. So you don't create variables and then not use them anywhere. They're just dead weight. So that's what it's telling you about here. Let's see if there's anything in the user interface. Okay. So we see that in there. Message 2 is not defined. Search for keywords to learn more. Let's hit F12. Okay. So we have a couple things we need to adjust. Okay. So under message JSX, we have line 8, 6. Let's go here, message JSX. So it makes sense that message 2 is not defined. We didn't copy it over. Okay, we'll copy it over later. So for now, let's just take that one out. Okay, so we're just going to be showing the first message 01, which is this one here. Okay. And now I'm going to adjust the screen so that maybe we can see both of these at the same time. Okay. Okay, so now it says module not found can't resolve message.css. Okay, so we need a message CSS file. I think the CSS file in this case is going to be translatable from our other one, so we'll just copy it over, message CSS. Okay, we see it's just regular CSS content. That doesn't change. And we'll drop it into here. Okay. Okay, so now we see we have this hi there component. Okay, we've just made some adjustments. And let's go back to message.tsx, JSX. Okay, and so this is what it looks like. Okay, but by and large, what we have here is just copied over from the JavaScript version of the program, and it hasn't added any features that are specific to TypeScript. Okay, so one of the things that we can add, okay, is to set up these properties, because right now these properties are not safeguarded, right? You can pass in properties that don't really match what we're trying to do. Now, all we're doing is we're outputting, let's see, we're outputting this message, props.message. So in this case, it's probably not going to be a big problem if we change that to a different type, okay? But if we were passing this value, this props value, into a method that needed a string, then we would need to guarantee that the string was there. Okay, so let's take a look here. Well, what we want to do is we want to give props a type. Okay, we'll call it props type, and we need to define that type. So we define the type like this: props type. Okay, equals, and let's see what it says. And all this is going to do is it's going to have message on it of type string. Okay, and I think, let me just make sure I've got that props type, and I'll just double check it with the code that I already wrote earlier. So okay. Yeah, so type props, that should be just equal. Okay, and let's see if what the other questions were. So this is one of the things you get out of working with TypeScript, and specifically with Visual Studio Code, is that you can hover over things and it'll give you information about those items. So now we're taking a look at this props type, and the props type says that our props can have a message, okay, and the message has to be of type string. So this is the syntax which is specific to TypeScript. Okay, when you're creating a property and you put a colon after it, it's going to expect the type. Okay. And let's see, this is JSX, so that should be fine. And I'm just saving that. And let's see what the question is here. TypeScript React app, that should be the right one. Yeah, so this is misbehaving. Let's go take a look here. Oh, yeah, if you notice what happened is I renamed the file in the wrong way. It should be TSX instead of JSX, so I was going a little too fast when I did that. Let's just go down and rename it properly, because it won't know how to compare that file with the rules unless it has the right extension. So this is TSX, or TypeScript and JSX. Okay. Now when we come back to it, we'll close out the other files and reopen it from here. Okay. Now we see that it's okay with the props type. Okay. So the props type equals message string. I'm just going to make it a little bit easier to read. Okay. Now this does a couple of things. When I go down to use props down here, you notice that it's props.message. Okay, but what about if I spelt this wrong and I have 3 S's, right? Okay, then it should come up and it should say property message does not exist on the props type. Okay, and it also suggests which it might be. Maybe you meant message, right? So this is a way to check your code even before you finished compiling it, to make sure that it is working properly. Okay. And if we had other properties on there, message and theme and text and things like that, those would be the only ones that are allowed when I start using the props object here inside of the component. Okay. So we're getting that protection there. Okay. Let's just see if we can recompile it. Okay. And let's do this. Sometimes the compiler gets a little confused, so we'll just close it down and restart it. So we'll go back up to here. We're in this one here, TypeScript React app. Open up a terminal and run that again. npm start. Okay, so it'll put it up on port 3001. Okay. Okay, so we see here that it's now printing it out okay. Let's see if there's any messages here. Okay, there is one. Okay, and we can just follow what it says here. Message.tsx, which is the file, line 1, position 17. It says use state is defined, but it's never used. Okay. So we go to 1, and we see that use state is here, and it's in gray rather than in black. Okay. So what that means is that it hasn't been used anywhere in the application yet. So that's just warning us against that, and I'll delete it. That was a result of our cut and paste. Okay. And then let's see what else it says. Message, line 310, start is defined but never used. And we'll get rid of that. So it helps you clean up your code in addition to just making your code less likely to have bugs in it. Okay. So now the compiler over here on the lower left is okay. It doesn't have any error messages. And the messages that normally would have been shown up here, they don't show because we're okay. We don't have any problems with it. Okay. So again, let's just review what we did. We copied in this code, and then we adjusted it so it had some type safety in it. Okay. The type safety was specifically around the props that we're now telling it that we want the props to be of a specific type. Okay. So if we pass in the wrong type, okay, it will complain. And if we try to use a type or property that's not on the type, it'll also complain. Okay. So now we know that this is functioning. Let's take a look at the application here. We had another component, a class-based component, which is similar. It's a messaging component. Okay. But in this case, it has this interactivity. I can click on it and it changes the theme from a dark theme to a light theme. Okay. So we'll take a look at that. That's also implemented, in this case, in message.js. This is called message2. Okay. And we see this is a class-based component, export class, extends React component. Okay. So we'll just start off by copying it over, adding it to our current application. Okay, there'll be some issues in there that we'll fix. The first one is we want to show it here. So it's called message02. So now the application should show it if it doesn't have any problems compiling it. Okay, but now we'll start to see some of the issues, then we'll fix them. Okay, let's see. So here, message.js. Okay, this is for the other component. This is the one we're working on here. I bet after that switch, you'd rather be on the other one, right? But normally when you see error messages, always go to the top one, fix that one first. Sometimes it fixes all of them. And if not, then you go down and you look at the other ones, okay? So what does it say over here? It goes to message TSX, okay? TypeScript error on line 8, position 12, which is the one that's being pointed out here by the compiler also, okay? So it says message, no overloads match this. So this is the part that's important here. Message string is not assignable to type intrinsic attributes. Okay. So the thing is, with React components that are class-based components, we need to set it up and tell it what the type of the state is going to be and what the type of the properties is going to be. Okay, and we do that by adding something here in front of the component and then adding it as a generic. Okay, and that will help to fix this particular message that we have. Okay. Let's take a look here. Let's see, it won't be in there. You can close that down for now. We're just going to go to some example code for that. Okay, message TSX. Okay, so we're going to take this and then we'll explain it. We're going to create two types. Types are kind of like classes, but they do less than a class does. They're specifically around the shape of the data. Okay, talking about the shape of the data. So here they're saying that something that is of the type prop type, okay, in this case, is going to have a message in a string. We could have, I guess, used the one up here. Let's just adjust that one. We'll make that prop type instead of props. Well, we'll use props type down here. So this one we'll get rid of, and we'll use the one that was already created, props type. Okay, then we have a state type. Okay, and the state type is going to include theme and string. I think I want to bring this back and just comment it out so that you can see them both next to each other. This will be props type. Okay, so where do we use those? Well, we need to specify in the component itself that we're going to have a props type of a certain shape, and we're going to have the state that's being held by the class component is of a certain type. It's a state type. Okay, so that's how you do that there. Then the state type, we also need to put here. This is the state. We're going to say it's of the type state type. Now, if the data matches the type, which it does here, theme, it has a theme, and the value is a string, then we're okay. Okay. So let's start off by compiling that. I hit Control S to save the file. Okay. And now we see that that compiles. So that message went away, and I'm able to click on it, and it's showing both themes. Okay. So let's take a closer look at the code and see how this is helping us out. Right? So one of the things that's happening is up here, when we create the message to, we're passing in a message. Things that are passed in here are always going to go on the props object. Okay. What about if I tried to pass in something and I put an X there by accident? Okay, so I spelled it wrong. Okay, now I get an error message, and when I look in the compiler, it says, it points to right here, and it says property message X does not exist on the type. Okay, and then if you keep on going, let's see, it should mention where the type is. Okay, so it's basically saying is it doesn't match the type we have for our props. Now we could fix that in one way by changing this back to just message, but the other way to do that would be to change message here, okay, to message X, right? Then that error up here is going to go away. The problem is we'd be creating an error down here. Okay, so we'd have to change it here also for that. And let's see if that'll do it. Let's save it. Okay, so there's one more place, and this would have to be message X. And we're getting closer. So that should match that. That goes on properties. Okay, and let's see what the exact error message is. And down here, oh, so this would have to change to message X. Okay. So I changed it in a bunch of places, but really what I was trying to show was that whatever you pass in has to match what's on the props type. Okay, the type defines what properties can be on that props object. Okay, and as long as they match, then everybody's okay. Like here, all the messages are message X. Okay, if I want this to be messaged the way it was before, I'd need to change them all back so that the type has that message, and that whenever we use something from that props object, it's calling the one with the proper name. Okay, so I just changed them back to message. Okay, so that's the first thing it does. Is it keeps us safe when it comes to that. If we go down here and we type in the wrong thing, it'll inform us, so we won't be wondering why the data is not showing up. Okay. The other part of this is the state. So properties are data that's passed into a component when the component's created. The state is data that's held by the component. Okay, it's maintained by the component, so it's not passed in, right? So here we have state type. Okay, and here's the name of its state. So the state type is the type of it, so which means it can include a theme. And then we assign it something of that shape, okay, that has a theme in it. Okay, if I tried to assign it something themes, okay, it's going to immediately tell me that there's a problem there, and the compiler is going to show that problem, and it's going to show up in the browser also. Okay, so I'm going to get plenty of information about the fact that that is incorrect in some way. And then I can go back, change it to match the type. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to miss that issue. Okay. So how does this actually work? So what we have here is we're showing a div. Okay, and in that div, we're going to have an onClick. So if you click on anything in the div, it goes to onClick. What onClick does is it changes the theme. Okay, so you start off by just creating a new theme object. Okay, then you go and you check the current theme. If this .state, which is held by the component .theme equal to dark, then change the new theme to be light. Okay, if it was already light, then you change it to dark. Okay, and then like you do with class components, you have to make that change permanent by doing a set state. So you pass the new state into set state. That does two things. It changes the state, the current state, okay, and then it re-renders the component. Okay. So that's what's going to happen on there. You do a click, it changes the theme, and then it recreates the component with the new theme. And that's what's happening every time I do a click. So I click on there, it changes the theme to the light theme and then displays it. I click again, it does the opposite, changes it to the dark theme and then compiles it. Okay. So that's basically what's happening here. The other part of this is that we're getting, in this case, we're getting the data about the message from properties. Okay, so this .props message. We're using this because it's in a class-based component, right? If we didn't have a class-based component, we could just use props.message, right? Okay. So those are a couple of components, a component that's based on the class and a component that's based on a function. Okay. Now, I want to just jump over to the chat, and I think there were some questions. Okay, so one of the questions here, I'm sorry, this was from a while ago, still relevant though. What type of code is compiled? Okay, so one thing about this is that we call it, or we say that the code is being compiled, that we're taking the code that we see in here, which is in our file. Okay, this is code that includes TypeScript, JavaScript, and JSX code. Okay, therefore we make the extension TSX for TypeScript and JSX. Okay, so that's the type of code that's being quote unquote compiled. Okay, the more accurate term for it is transpiled. Okay, that's the true technical description of what's happening. Transpilation is doing a translation from one language to another. In this case, from TypeScript and JSX to ECMAScript 5, which is plain vanilla JavaScript. Okay, so that's the compiling that's happening. We call it compiling because the word compile is just used so much throughout programming, but technically we're translating or transpiling because it's going from a human-readable script file to another human-readable script file. It's just a translation, okay? But it also gives the process that's doing that a chance to spit out error messages that help us out. Okay? Now, there was another question about ECMAScript, which I've been talking about. When you talk about JavaScript, there is no JavaScript standard, right? The standard that defines JavaScript is the ECMAScript standard. Okay, so it's a little confusing, but that's the way it is. So ECMAScript 5 is the standard version of JavaScript. ECMAScript 6 is an enhanced version of JavaScript that runs on some browsers but not on others. And then there's later ones like ECMAScript 7 is also proposed. And then there's TypeScript, which includes features of those different JavaScript or ECMAScript versions. Okay. So there's, I got one or two other questions, then somebody just added another question. Do you have to install TypeScript? Okay, well, TypeScript has to be installed, okay, but when you do that stage where you go and you do npx create React app and you do -- template TypeScript, it automatically adds TypeScript to your project, okay? So it is installed for you by that process. If you're going to install it into an existing project, okay, like we saw here, okay, to an existing project, then you need to do an install and explicitly install TypeScript, okay? Okay. The IDE or development environment I'm using right here, this is Visual Studio Code, okay? So it's a free download. It's a Microsoft product. The other thing to know about TypeScript is that TypeScript is a Microsoft product, or it's open source, but it's heralded by Microsoft. So they're the ones who are in charge of it, and they do a really good job of they have a site for TypeScript where you can get a lot of information and learning on TypeScript, and their own tool, Visual Studio Code, is built to work with TypeScript very closely. Okay, so here's a question. Why do we define onClick on the class name? So let's take a look at that. So message TSX. So let's see where were you doing this, right? So here's our component. Okay, onClick here is a member of the class. Okay, so we're defining this code that's going to be run when you call this member, the onClick member. Okay. Down here, let's see. So down here in the div, onClick is referring to the event that's going to trigger this. So when the click event hits the div, it will go to this piece of code here. Okay, and then it will run this .onClick, which is this up here. Okay, so I don't know if that answered that question for you, but if you're still wondering about it, let me know. So I think the original question was, why do you define onClick again on the class name? So here's the class name, right? So we don't define it up there, but we define it down here as part of a member of the class. Line 33, okay. Okay, class name. Okay, class here, okay, this is part of React, okay? The class that they're talking about here is, you know, when you have an element like an H1 tag or a div or something like that, and you say class equals hidden, or class equals bordered, or class equals, you know, red component or something like that. That's the class that's being mentioned here, okay? So it's allowing you to define the class that's going to be the CSS class that's going to be applied to this div, okay? So what we do here is we say class name equals, and we have a little bit of code in here. It just says, if the theme is equal to dark, then return dark as the name of the class that you want to assign. If it's not that, then you assign light as the class. And if we look under our messages CSS, those two things then will activate either the dark CSS here or the light CSS, and that'll change the color scheme. Okay. Okay, so here's a question that gets asked a lot. Which framework is trending towards being adopted more, React or Angular? Okay. I would say that Angular is probably going to be more widespread, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that that means that Angular is better than React. Okay, what I think that means is that the people who need to use Angular are looking for something that is a little bit more complete, and they have to make less decisions, okay? With React, the React part of it is simply the component part, okay? And you get to make decisions on what you need to use for routing and for state management and for all those other things. So React takes more of a effort on your part to compile together a bunch of different technologies to use in your particular application, but it also gives you that freedom to do that. Whereas Angular has a whole bunch of things that are bundled together already, and you either have to use it all as one big thing that's usable, or or you have to find something else, right? Because it's a bundle of a bunch of things that are already chosen for you. Okay, so those are kind of the ways that you would choose one or the other, right? You choose Angular if you don't really want to think about the technology a lot. You know it has a bunch of things in it. You just go ahead and use it. Okay. If you have a very demanding application and you want to have more control over everything that happens in the application, then React might be a good way to go for that. Okay. So I think that pretty much does everything for us. There's just one other question I want to answer, and it has to do with the site for TypeScript, which I'll give you in a second. Should be typescriptlanguage.org. So I'll show you that here. So here is the typescriptlang.org. Okay, so you can go there. A lot of information about TypeScript there. Very helpful. Okay, so I hope this was helpful to everybody. Let's just leave this on the WebAge screen here. So I'm Mark Pawlowski. I'm from WebAge Solutions, and we generated this webinar so that we could, give some people some information about this kind of up-and-coming way of working with React. We're a training company, so if you or your team needs any training, we customize training for exactly how you need it run in your organization. So here's some contact information where you can get a hold of us. Okay. And with that, before we run over too much more, I'm just going to sign off. Good luck with your development.